Hello everyone, my name is Luba. Today we're gonna do a recap of the 8 books I read in March. Also, I read most of my books on my Kindle, so I don't have the book to hold up and show, but I'm gonna put the pictures here so you can kind of track which book I'm talking about. So the first book I read is called Ikigai by Francis Morales and Hector Garcia. It's this short, kind of 200-page book, which is nonfiction and a little bit of self-help, and it talks about this philosophy to life that many Japanese people have, which is called ikigai. And it talks about finding something to work in which you like doing, which earns you money, which is helpful to society, and which you are good at. So that is kind of the basis of the book, this philosophy, ikigai. However, it goes to so many different directions and explores other topics. For example, a big focus of this book is these people who have lived over 100 years, specifically in Okinawa, Japan, and it talks about the healthy habits they've adopted, the kind of lives they led in order to achieve such a long life. So there's a big focus on longevity, and if you're interested in something like that, then I think you would like this book. And also there was quite a lot of good tips for self-improvement. For example, the first hour and the last hour of being awake, you don't use any digital devices. So I kind of found the idea very interesting, and I've started to implement it into my life. I've yet to achieve that full hour, but I've been trying to read before bed and right after waking up, and I have already noticed a difference in how I feel and in general how my day goes. So I think there's some good tips in this book. However, there was this section where the authors described how to do certain exercises, and I was really confused on how to do them. I tried replicating them and I just couldn't do them. So I thought that whole section was redundant to the book and just was unnecessary. But overall, I gave it a 4.5 stars. So it was really nice, and I enjoyed how optimistic the tone is, and in general how lighthearted it is at the same time it is reflective. Okay, next book I read is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, the only book I read in physical form this month. So the story follows 4 sisters, Jo, Meg, Amy, and Beth, and their life in the US during the Civil War. The Civil War in the United States aren't really important or central to the story. It's more so just the setting that they're in, and it just talks about their adventures, their challenges and tribulations. And I thought it was very sweet and just a warm-hearting read. I enjoyed the sisterly bond that they have. I enjoyed the friendships that the characters developed with non-relatives, for example, Laurie and Jo, or Beth and Laurie's grandfather. One thing I really like about this book is that the characters didn't feel flat. For example, the main character, who's Jo, she's a little bit boyish, she's spunky, she loves reading and writing, and she has her negative sides, but ultimately she's a good person. And this is really in contrast to many books I've been reading lately, where sometimes the characters feel all the same, like they're all the same person, and the only thing that differentiates them is the experiences they went through. But here I really feel like each character's personality is different, which I really like. In addition, I found that Louisa May Alcott described the nature and the setting in which the characters were in a very beautiful way. It was just enchanting to read about these things. I actually gave this a 5-star, and I really don't give 5 stars often to a book. If you want to get into classics, I think this is a great way to start. The language here isn't too difficult. There are a couple words there and there that I felt like I had to look up, but generally speaking, it's very accessible compared to many other classics that I've read, and it's also just more entertaining. However, do be warned that it is a little bit slow paced compared to a lot of modern books, and this is just characteristic of what books were like in the 1800s. But I think the reason why I felt that it was a bit slow is more attributed to the fact that my attention span has unfortunately been decreased due to social media. Also, I thought this was the full book at first, but as it turns out, there's a second part, Great Wives, which is often included as just one book, and the adaptations of Little Women are actually based off the 2 books. So I need to read the other book in order to watch the movies, but after I finish Great Wives, I'll be very excited to watch the movies. The next book I read is The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov. This is another classic. It's a play, and it's only about 90 pages. I didn't like this very much. I gave it a 3.5 stars. To me, that's just okay. You know, it wasn't a good reading experience, but I think one big reason why I didn't like it is because it wasn't written to be read, but rather written to be performed and watched as a play, so I'm sure it will be much more fun to watch. So the story follows this woman, her name is Lyubov Ranevska. She comes back to Russia with her daughter to her estate, with which there are cherry orchard plantations, and the conflict revolves around the fact that this estate might be potentially sold. She has to sell it due to the fact that she owes a lot of money. And that's kind of the central conflict of the story. But the plot is not particularly important here. Anton Chekhov mainly focuses on the characters and how they interact with each other. I also found the way they spoke with each other a bit too coarse for my liking. I just found it strange. Maybe it's characteristic to the time. That is how they spoke with each other. But I found it a little bit too rude, and it didn't seem like something bad. It just was normal for the times, I suppose. In general, it just wasn't particularly interesting to me. I think this is a typical classic which can be analyzed for hours and hours in an English class, but ultimately it's not that fun to read. Next, I read The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. I gave this a 4.5 stars out of 5. This was a very powerful and informative book. I learned a lot about the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Israel-Arab conflict. I wasn't particularly informed about the conflict prior to this, so I wanted a comprehensive overview of what really transpired. I didn't give this a 5 stars because, number one, I found some descriptions of violence to be a bit too graphic. They weren't extremely graphic, but I just prefer not knowing all these details. I feel like I can be sympathetic to the people and understand what they're going through without having descriptions of violence presented to me. Also, I felt like the author overlooked the violence that has been perpetrated by certain Palestinians toward Israel, and I thought that was a bit strange because I think it's important to acknowledge that both sides have done things that are really terrible, and he didn't mention it that much, and at some points I felt like he was even agreeing with what they did. So that's a factor of why I didn't give it 5 stars. I think one big takeaway from this book for me was the fact that people who supported Zionism early on were aware of the fact that Zionism cannot be implemented without the forceful displacement of Palestinians. And this has been clear through all of the past 100 years of history of Palestine. Furthermore, I found it very surprising how big of a role the US and the UK has been in the inaction of the State of Israel and how much they supported Israel to become what it became today. I just think it's a very great educational read that people should read to just become more informed about the current state of the conflict. Next, I read another nonfiction book. I really read a lot of nonfiction this month. Not particularly on purpose, it just happened. I usually prefer fiction, but oh well. The next book I read is Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. It discusses how and why men and boys struggle today in the modern times. And I think a lot of times the struggles of men can be overlooked because ultimately they are more privileged than women, even now. Yet it's still important to acknowledge these issues. For example, why boys are behind in school compared to girls and what to do about it. One very interesting thing that I learned from this book is how this role of a father changed through the times and how now it's just not as clear as it was before, which leads a lot of men to lose their purpose in life generally. I've seen these podcasts where men will talk about how they wish everything was the way it was before, where the woman stayed at home and didn't work while the father earned the money, and they wished it was the same as it was then. And I almost found it strange because why would you want it that way when many women want to work? And I think reading this book made the perspectives of these men clear to me. This book helped me understand why a lot of men feel lost these days. Unfortunately, I felt like some of the solutions that the author came up with weren't very practical. Also, the author discusses why there is a wage gap between men and women, and I found that part very interesting as well. So if you're interested in these kinds of topics, I think you'll like this book. I gave it a 4 stars out of 5. Again, there were some issues with it that I had, and there was a section that I didn't really like, found a bit strange to read about, but alas, let's go to the next book. Next, I read In Praise of Shadows by Janichiro Tanizaki. This is a very short essay about art, philosophy, architecture, and all of it kind of ties to Japan and the author's worldview of how things are developing. It's very interesting to read because the author's writing style is sort of a stream of consciousness where he goes from one topic to another without clear separation. The central part of the story are shadows, sometimes literally and sometimes metaphorically, that exist in Japanese society. I think there was a lot of interesting discussions on ageism, the development of technology, the West versus the East, the Western influence on the East, such as Japan, and it was quite thought-provoking in some moments. However, I gave it a 4 stars instead of higher because the author had a little bit of a pessimistic tone towards modernism and novelty, despite no real reason to be pessimistic about these kinds of things, and I just didn't enjoy it. I just enjoyed that. Next, I read another Japanese novel. Finally, we're back to fiction. It's Goodnight Tokyo by Atsuhiro Yoshida. This was another short book, and it's a collection of 10 short stories of 10 different people, and all of their stories are intertwined together. It shows also the nocturnal side of Tokyo, and I think the plot is a little bit hard to explain because it focuses on 10 different people and there's not something that ties them all together in the same way. Basically, we first meet this woman, her name is Matsuki, and she works as a procurer for film, and then she meets a taxi driver and his name is Matsui, and then he meets someone else, and it's kind of this chain of events where they meet each other. I gave this a 4.25 out of 5. This was a very kind of comforting, chill, cozy read. However, I thought the characters were a little bit flat. And lastly, I read Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, another classic, and this was actually my lowest rated book of the month. I gave it a 2.5 stars out of 5, unfortunately. So the first half of the story was quite interesting. We follow a man, his name is Phileas Fogg, and he bets money with his friends that he will be able to travel around the world in 80 days, mainly on trains. And it follows his adventures around the world with his servant Passepartout. I don't remember how to pronounce his name. I thought it was a little bit boring and dry a lot of the times, even though it's supposed to be kind of exciting and fast-paced. And also, I just found some moments to be very strange. Like, there was some moments of violence. For example, there was some fighting, and there was this one moment, which is a little bit of a spoiler, so you can skip to this timestamp if you don't want to hear it, where Phileas Fogg was about to duel with this other guy. I thought it was really strange. I mean, it got interrupted, but it's still... So these are the books I read this month. Some fiction, some non-fiction, classics, and modern books. Basically, all sorts of books I read this month. If you want to read books for free, I'm actually going to be releasing a video about how to do so soon, so make sure to check that out.